Yeah, I'm alive. Hey guys, welcome back to Critical African Thinkers. As you know, this is a place where we examine everything under the microscope of logic to ascertain what is most factual and logically consistent. So today, I want to review a conversation between Mark Lamont Hill and Coleman Hughes on reparations. Coleman Hughes is a very big anti-reparations kind of person, and Mark Lamont Hill is someone who is in favor of reparations for African Americans. So I'm going to review this interaction they've had and to just try to pick out some of the things that I find issues with in Coleman's analysis. I know all of Coleman's arguments against reparations, right? There are some of them I sort of agree with. There are others that I don't agree with, but I think his arguments are poor or not very strong. And we're just going to be looking at it. I'll share my thoughts on what I think he gets right and what I think he doesn't quite get right. For me, I think most of the argument against reparation that I've seen are usually not very well thought out. They are either strawman arguments or arguments that don't make any sense. I, I think reparations is a distraction. I think it might never happen, but at least be intellectually honest when you're covering such a topic, right? Don't give nonsense examples of saying a reparations it's like asking white people to pay for. Nah, it really isn't about something like that. So if you're just coming, like, share, and subscribe to the channel. So let's dive right into this conversation.
Welcome back to Black News Tonight. More than 40 years in the making, the Slavery Reparations Bill, known as H.R. 40, is making its way to the House floor. But the historic measure faces an uphill battle in the gridlocked Senate. The disagreement within the Black community regarding reparations crystallized on Juneteenth, 2019, when a House Judiciary Subcommittee held a hearing on the bill. The voice leading the charge against reparations on that day was Coleman Hughes, as he called the bill a moral and political mistake.
Black people don't need another apology. We need safer neighborhoods and better schools. We need a less punitive criminal justice system. We need affordable health care. And none of these things can be achieved through reparations for slavery. And the obligation of citizenship is not transactional.
So first of all, when was the first apology? I must have missed when that first apology happened. Is it just verbal apology? These are the things that he mentioned about safer neighborhoods, about healthcare, and so on and so forth. Are these things not a carryover from the sort of history, the sort of things that African Americans faced in the US? Are these things not as a result, not totally all of them, but some of them as a result of not just slavery, but Jim Crow and all other things? I think when a lot of people talk about reparations, they're only looking at the slavery part of it. But in my mind, I think post-slavery, before the 1960s, was even much more worse for African Americans because they were technically free, or they were quote unquote legally free, but still were not free. There were still a lot of things they were still discriminated against in so many ways, and they didn't have the luxury of being in the plantation where at least they will be provided their food and the shelter will be provided for. Now, this is not me making an argument for slavery. I'm just saying that it wasn't any better after they got their freedom without full citizenship, without the benefits of all the opportunities that America had to offer. So, if some of the things that you find in Black America today are a carryover from those things, then there should be something in place to address those issues specifically, because these issues were not just naturally occurring things. These happen because of specific policies put in place by the United States government.
It's not contingent on ancestry. It never expires, and it can't be paid off. For all these
This sort of argument that, oh, you can't do something that is quote unquote race based. I know race is it's a false construct, right? But in this context, it's relevant and it's viable. It's just like saying that when you look at women, there are issues that are specific to women. And when you want to address issues that are specific to women, you can't just say, let's have a human policy. Let's have a policy that addresses all human. But the issues are very specific to this class of people. So while it does make sense for you to say, let's have something that embraces everybody, I don't see the downside in addressing specific issues for specific group. Okay, let's take crime for example. If, for example, we want to say that crime is very, very rampant in African American communities, and maybe there are some factors that are responsible for that you find in that community but you don't find in other communities, don't you think it would be good to tailor your solutions towards what the problems are rather than just having a policy that's open-ended for everyone? This idea that just because it is quote unquote a race-based policy makes it totally bad. The reason why you're thinking it's totally bad was because in the past when such things were usually done at the detriment of a certain group. They weren't done with positive intent. They were done with the intent to harm other people. So you're thinking that okay, if you have something that's specifically for black people, then it's going to be at the detriment of white people. It doesn't really work that way. I don't see how trying to uplift African Americans is going to be at the detriment of white people. No one has ever articulated why that is the case. Why, if you institute reparations for African Americans, that somehow white people are going to suffer. I've not seen anybody make an articulate argument for that position, but that's essentially what they're saying.
Reasons, Bill H.R. 40 is a moral and political mistake. Thank you.
Welcome to university.
Apply to study abroad with the Duolingo English test.
Joining me now is Coleman Hughes. He's the host of Conversations with Coleman. It's a podcast that he hosts. Coleman, thank you so much for joining me. Let's get started right away with this question of opposing the idea of reparations. You talk about it as a moral mistake as well as a political mistake. What's the moral mistake here?
The moral mistake is that obviously when the victims of a historical crime are still alive, there is a moral obligation of the perpetrators to pay reparations. When we're talking about, so for instance, it would be a morally necessary, in my opinion, as I said at the hearing, to pay reparations for Jim Crow to survivors of the Jim Crow system. Now, on the other hand, when you're talking about the median Black American being around 35 years old or so, born in the 80s, is there a moral obligation to take money from one group of people and give it to that person for a crime that happened 200 years ago? That's a very different situation, and one in which you have to consider whether it's politically wise to do that, whether it actually serves the interests of the community that is suffering from many different problems in the present that need to be solved. To frame that solution as reparations, saying essentially blaming a group of people that don't feel connected to the crime because it was so long ago, right? So that's what I mean by a moral and political mistake.
So I think Coleman's argument is a mistake, is an intellectual mistake, and I'll give you reasons why. So first of all, he's talking about um, people who suffered from Jim Crow. They can be paid reparations. I can bet you that there are people, the African Americans alive today, who went through all these things before 1964. I mean, 1960 or 19, the 1960s is not such a long time ago. It's not such a long time. There are many people who were born maybe in the 1950s, I guess maybe like late 1950s, or people whose parents were born in that era who saw those things as kids. Have reparations be paid to those people? I mean, they are people who directly suffered from such things. Has reparations been paid to those people? So this idea that so much time has passed, so nothing can be done because all the people who suffered from those things are dead and gone makes no sense, because there are people that you can argue for, and you would find people who were born during the time when such things were in place, where African Americans didn't really have the full rights of citizens. Has Coleman ever tried to identify such people and say, let's make a case for these people, let them actually get their reparations? It's all a dodge. Then the other point about taking money from one group of people to another, that's just silly. That's the silliest argument I've ever heard about why reparations shouldn't work. Who exactly is taking money from one group of people to give to the other group of people? Who is taking slavery, Jim Crow were a US government backed institution. Those were US government backed institutions. So if there's anyone who's supposed to be held responsible, it's the US government. I know people would say, well, taxpayer money is everybody's money. Of course, it's everybody's money. But taxpayer money is still African Americans' money. It isn't just only white people that are paying into that pot. So even if the money is taken from taxpayer money, it's not necessarily that white people are paying. What about Asians? What about other groups in America? What about the Hispanics? They are taxpayers too. Does that mean money is taken away from them? But it is, they are trying to frame it, or Coleman is trying to frame it as taking something from white people and giving to black people. No, this is a debt that is owed by the US government, and the US government has to do good on it. And when the US government is doing good on it, it doesn't mean it's taken from one section of the society, or from some people and give it to another people. No, when the US, when they had internment camp for Japanese citizens of the US, when they paid reparations to them, it was because it wasn't necessarily a white people thing. It was a US government thing. Even though you could technically argue that most people in charge of the government at that time were white people, and they did that thing to Asians, they did that to Japanese, right? You could argue, but no one in their right mind is going to say this is a reparations paid by white people to Japanese people. It it doesn't make any sense to make that argument. And this is the weakest argument people who are anti-reparations they all usually bring up. They say, as a white person, if you feel responsible for slavery and you feel responsible for what your ancestors did, I've got to ask you, why do you feel responsible? Why do you feel responsible? If you feel attacked when someone is talking about reparations and all this, the things that's happened in the past, you have to ask yourself, why do you feel attacked? Why does it make you uncomfortable? You were not the one who did all that shit. So the fact that you're feeling uncomfortable is a problem in itself.
So there's a few leaps there that I want to unpack with you for a minute. So you start by saying that it would be a morally proper thing to do if the victims of a crime were still alive. And then when we get to these people born in the 1980s, you're saying, well, if the redress comes through them, if we give it to their great 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 grandchildren, it produces a political sort of challenge and crisis for the community, if I understand you correctly. And it may not be the proper way to address the needs of the broader community. Understood. I hear that argument. That still doesn't address why it would be not moral to do so, right? If for example, there were a person who was enslaved, and slavery ends, and they have a child, just one generation, just a child, who was denied access to housing, health care, and in general American prosperity because their parent was a slave, an enslaved African. Would you, just in that example, would you say that it would be improper to give reparations to them?
Yeah, so that I'm not. I think in that case, probably it would be proper, and obviously it's a case by case basis. But the closer you are to the crime, the more plausible and morally required it is to give somebody reparations.
Doesn't make any sense. It makes absolutely no logical sense. For this is an arbitrary, he's making an arbitrary line. He's drawing an arbitrary line. What exactly do you mean closer you are? What determines the close one generation is? What is that what you determine as being as close as possible to the harm done, for enough for you to have reparations? Two generations, three generations? It's either, as you have said earlier, Coleman, it's either those who were affected directly or none. Or you can say, because this effect has persisted in the descendants of people who were harmed, then you have to do something to redress it. Those are the only two logical. Trying to bring in some arbitrary, yeah, someone was born close enough. I can tell you that people who are living today are one generation away from Jim Crow, or they're one generation away from legalized discrimination against African Americans. So, by Coleman's own logic, African Americans today should be eligible for reparations by his own logic. But he's going to weirdly argue something else.
And you always have to take into account the other side of the equation here, right? If my grandfather does something to if your grandfather did something horrible to my grandfather, I couldn't necessarily come to you and expect you to pay me directly, right? That would be immoral. So obviously, the closer you are to the crime, you're exactly right. The more necessary, the more morally required it is, and it's a damn shame that reparations were not paid to
Nobody is requiring for white people to pay for the crimes of their grandfathers. This is just a straw man, it's a stupid straw man argument. You're not going to meet any white person and trying to extract value from them and say, come and pay for the actions of your grandfather. It's the US government. Get it into your head. It's the US government that has been asked to make good. It was US laws, it wasn't private laws that backed up slavery or Jim Crow or whatever. It was US laws. So if for example, the US is owing 200 years ago, the US is owing, say, Canada a certain amount of money, can the US today say, oh, because it's 200 years later, the people who borrowed the money from Canada are no longer anymore, they are all gone and dead. So we can't pay back this money that we're owing because how can I be paying for something that my grandfather took? Your grandfather didn't take that money as an individual. That money was taken as the government. As I really don't understand what is so difficult to understand in this analysis.
recently freed slaves and their children. Unfortunately, it is a different situation we're dealing with today. And you can't, it's not that just because reparations were due and never paid for a historical crime does not necessarily mean that the great great grandchildren, say, can demand of the great great grandchildren of the perpetrators that you pay me now. It's tragic, but a multiracial society with a history like we do cannot survive if the principle we're gonna abide by is we're not only solving our crimes, but we're trying to solve all of the crimes of history. And
You see, this is the problem I have with many right leaning people. Coleman is going to say he's not right leaning, but he is anyway. They cannot think beyond black and white narratives. They can't think, they are so binary, they have no intellectual depth. There's no depth in what he's saying. That black Americans or African Americans, they are requiring of white people to pay them. No, it's not white people that are requiring. It's not white people. I'm just repeating myself at this point.
litigate
Yeah.
the oppression that has gone on in this country in the present.
There's a brand new AI tool that does prompt to YouTube video, as in you type in a short prompt and within a couple minutes it gives you an
So two things. One, the reason I was making that point about the one generation is because then you're not actually rejecting the idea of paying future generations as such. You're simply saying we have to. It's about the level of proximity to the harm that was done. What reparations advocates have been doing since the end of slavery is demonstrating the proximity of the harm. That means that whether it's 1865 or 1965 or 2020, there is considerable empirical data to show that slavery, the cost of slavery, the price of slavery, the impact of slavery continues to be felt by Black people. And so while there may be a greater generational gap in terms of education, housing, healthcare, et cetera, we still see a considerable relationship between the harm and the violence of slavery and the impact it's had on multiple generations. And then the second thing you say, and I want you to respond to both of these, I want to give you space to respond to both of these, is this idea that we are somehow going to the grandchildren of people who were harmed and saying we're going to take care of it by going to the grandchildren of people who did the harm. That frames this as that frames reparations as this idea of going to white people and asking them to give money to Black people. The idea of reparations is not that. That's not the claim made by anybody who's advocating for reparations. That's not the demand, that's not the request, and that's not the analysis that's being offered. The idea here is that the institutions that were created out of slavery, whether it's the insurance industry, whether it's the banking industry, whether it's certain railroad companies, or whether it is many universities, all of these things were born out of the institution and the violence and the crisis of slavery. And those institutions continue to live, they continue to thrive, and they continue to reproduce inequality. And so the idea here is not to go hat in hand to random white people and give their money to random black people. It's to analyze a system that has given power and privilege to those institutions, and also that has created a gap in opportunity between black folk and white folk. And the demand and the ask that's being made is of the institution, it's of the very government which was built on the exploited labor of enslaved African people. And so I would reject the characterization of reparations as you do, and rather see this as a way of, as we quite literally analyze it as, repairing the damage that was done. That's the idea here.
So yeah, Mark is getting it a bit. For me, I don't think his analysis is as robust as I would want it to be. I wouldn't want, say for example, let's say there's a Harvard who, maybe there's an institution or whatever institution had foundations, from slavery and all such. I wouldn't even want them per se, those institutions per se, to pay reparations, because those institutions did not operate in and of themselves. The slavery or whatever it was the US government that enabled them to be able to do that. So whether or not those institutions exist now, whether they thrive, whether they are gone, whether they are, it should be irrelevant. The party that is guilty, the party that is responsible, the party that should pay is the US government. And you can say the US government is the US people. Well, good and fine, it was the US people. So the government and the people are one and the same. So the people oppressed part of its own population for hundreds of years, and the people have to do good by those people that they oppressed. So whatever way you want to frame it, it still comes down to the American government. Who supported this thing, right?
Okay, so two points to respond to there. The first is the idea that yes, slavery was technically long ago in terms of years, but the harm has persisted, and that can be shown in empirical data. So I think it's a lot more complicated than that. And listen, I know this is not a popular opinion, but my ancestors were slaves in this country, as most Black peoples were. And I think there's a degree to which people born today are appropriating the struggles of our ancestors. And if you think about it, consider, for instance, hypothetically, a Jewish
That's such a weird take. Okay, but let me just listen to his example.
person born in the 90s. To what extent does the Holocaust impact him? If he's going to go around and say that he's struggling because of the Holocaust, I think a lot of people would be very skeptical of that. They would say, maybe your parents, maybe your grandparents, but there's a certain amount of removal in years from the crime that makes those kinds of claims less plausible.
Okay, so now let's use this example that he's giving of this Jewish person who was born in the 1990s, whose grandparents were killed. All their family members were killed in Nazi Germany. Maybe just their father or their mother survived to be able to give birth to them. And all their properties were destroyed. Nothing, they had nothing. And that person today is poor as a result of that, because they lost their family, they lost their property. Are you going to tell me that they don't have a right to a claim to make that? Are you going to tell me that if they say that part of my condition today is caused by what happened to my ancestors 2 generations ago, that they're going to be appropriating what happened to the ancestors? Mind you, this Jewish example doesn't work because the Jewish people actually had reparations. So what's to tell that they would not have been as prosperous as they are today if those reparations were not paid? Germany actually paid reparations to the victims of the Holocaust, and many of them got their properties and so on and so forth. Many of that money was what went into building the state of Israel as it is today. So you don't expect people to come from nothing. I was watching a video of, a few days ago. It was a short on YouTube, and there were some farmers that were looking at a guy making an analysis on tractors and saying, well, this tractor costs like $100,000. And the farmers were just looking at this guy like, are you crazy? Then one of them asked, how much does this tractor, what can $100,000 buy you in this tractor? And he said, just the tires. So let's take, for example, a black family that wants to go into farming and another white family that's into farming. This white family, for generations, they've had the opportunity, the privilege, they built the wealth. And then you have this black family in the 1990s that wants to go into farming. And then you know that it costs a lot. There's a lot of financial investment. That tractor alone runs into millions of dollars. So, which of these two families do you think would be able to run a successful farming business? The one who has nothing, whose ancestors were deprived of an education, of opportunities to build wealth, or the one who has had all the privilege? Which do you think would be more successful? To just sit down and think that the past doesn't affect the future, it's nonsense.
And that's just my opinion. I understand that that's controversial, but I don't see how it's not true. And then on the second point,
okay, can I pause you on the first one just for clarity, and then I'll give you
sure.
space to answer the second one. On the first one, as a matter of fact, let's do this. Let's pause and take a commercial. The thing I had planned to do next, I'm not going to do. This is also for my producers.
We all know that job interviews can be scary, especially when you don't know what to expect. But what if you had an assistant?
The facts on the ground. There is a direct relationship between mass incarceration. If we look at the pattern from the end of slavery to the liberation, the emancipation of slaves, to the creation of black codes, to the creation of the convict lease system, to the creation of the modern prison industrial complex, to the creation of laws to fortify and fill the prisons, we see direct correlations, just as one example, between slavery and mass incarceration, and that has turned into a systemic problem. When you look at things like that, it seems hard to say that there's no connection between the slavery and what we're dealing with today. But I guess my question for you is, if we could empirically determine and persuade you that reparations, if I could persuade you that slavery had a direct impact on the lives of black people today and the prosperity chances of black people today, would you then be pro reparations?
That's a good question. So I think obviously the past influences the present in all kinds of complicated ways. I'm not denying that that's true.
See,
What I am
when someone says something is complicated, just know that they are bullshit. They're about to feed you a load of bullshit. Okay, it's complicated, break it down. He's going to spread it like, oh, it's, there's so many factors, but there is a very important factor here.
am saying is that when you look at the specifics, usually slavery gets blamed for things that often had nothing to do with slavery. So you mentioned mass incarceration. I would have to disagree. I mean, mass incarceration was a phenomenon that started in the late 70s. Before the late 70s, there was no mass incarceration. And it happened for complicated reasons relating to, bad incentives on the part of prosecutors, tough on crime laws. There's a lot of people still alive today that are to blame for mass incarceration. We can't.
So this guy doesn't know anything about the black codes. He doesn't know anything about African American history. He doesn't even know anything about American history. Just for the fact that mass incarceration got worse now doesn't mean it didn't have its roots in these discriminatory laws during the Jim Crow era, where African Americans could literally be arrested for, quote, jaywalking or for not having a job. Vagrancy laws, people who were just let off slavery didn't really have anything to do. There were no skills, there were no education, no opportunities for them. And you put laws in place to criminalize them not having jobs. And this dude is sitting here and saying, that has no correlation with the mass incarceration that we're seeing today. Okay.
Can't just blame the legacy of slavery. There are people to be held accountable, and I do think this is one way in which the simplistic sort of blaming everything on slavery in a weird way actually lets a lot of politicians that are
You are the one who is doing that. You are the one that's retroactively, you are creating a straw man. You are the one create when they use words like blame everything. Who exactly is blaming everything on slavery? They create this stupid straw man just so that you don't. If there was anyone alive today who is blaming everything on slavery, then you should know that that person is not a serious person, because obviously everything can be slavery's fault. But a huge percentage of that is, due to slavery, Jim Crow, and all those other things. So the nuance is totally gone. They go hyperbolic. They'll be like, blame everything, everything. So once you have used a word as absolute as everything, then you can't take that claim seriously, because I will not take anybody seriously who blames everything on slavery. But is anybody actually blaming everything on slavery? No, that's the bait and switch that he's doing here. He's trying to reframe the argument, he's trying to reframe the conversation to make it seem as if those who are advocating for this are unreasonable. They are blaming everything on slavery.
doing bad things right now off of the hook. So that's just one example to give here. And then to your second question of, if you could persuade me that there is, I think there's no doubt that slavery has had some impact. It's really hard to say how much, and everyone's individual family story of coming out of slavery into the present is unique, and how different families dealt with it. It's very hard to paint with a broad brush about the extent to which any given person's life trajectory in the present was influenced by slavery. That's a very complicated.
But you could do that for a group. Even if you don't do it for an individual, you could do that. You could measure the impact and the effect for a group. And you're seeing, just take some time to do due diligence. Don't just read a Wikipedia article. Actually do research and find out these things, Coleman. Seriously.
Question.
Well, but that's why we're offering systemic analysis, right? That's what we're saying. It's not about the individual case. It's saying that there are structural factors and structural determinants here, that the reality of Black folk writ large is affected by this. But just to be clear, and for time's sake, if I'm understanding you correctly, there actually is no amount of correlation that you would find persuasive enough to support reparations. It's not as if you knew that Black people's lives were directly impacted by this, you still would say no to reparations. Is that accurate?
I would, because even if you admit slavery is the root source of the problem, that doesn't imply necessarily that reparations is going to solve those problems. That's actually a fallacy.
But those are two different things. Those are two different things. Just because reparations, okay, let's take for example, reparations was given to Japanese Americans who were victims of whatever the hell the US did during the Second World War. Does that mean that today Japanese Americans should be excluded from any policy that is aimed at helping Americans in general? Or does that mean that because of that, all Japanese Americans are by that successful? This for me is a moral debt that really has nothing to do with whether or not it's going to help African Americans. Of course, I think it should help. And it necessarily doesn't have to even be in monetary terms, because I think he's thinking about it in monetary terms. It really doesn't have to be in monetary terms. It can be in other forms, but that conversation is not even being had. So when he's showing his hand now by saying there is no amount of correlation that would even make him agree with that position, because he's already ideologically captured and he can't see past his very narrow worldview. He can't see past that right-wing bubble that he's surrounded himself in. He just needs to come out of that bubble. I don't know, maybe for financial incentive, because he's built a career on this. He can't jeopardize. He can't jeopardize he can't jeopardize his source of income if he starts saying something else. I mean, I used to be like this guy. My channel used to be a lot better. Now the channel is not even monetized because YouTube did its thing. If possibly my source of income was dependent on this, maybe I'd have just stayed a right winger and be saying things that I don't actually believe anymore because that's my source of income. But that's what happens when there's a financial incentive behind why people do certain things. Many of these intellectuals out there have financial incentives for saying the things that they say. And that's why they're sounding very ridiculous. They sound very ridiculous. They can't anger their base. They can't say or do anything that is contrary to what their base wants to hear. So they cannot grow. So they keep saying the same things that people who not normally naturally listen to them want to hear.
So for example, if reparations were paid today, tomorrow we would still be living in a country, I would argue, that has, unsafe neighborhoods, dysfunctional public schools, poor healthcare, all the problems related to poverty would still exist. And we would.
Since when has reparations solved poverty? Since when has reparations solved the issue of poverty? Are you going to tell me that there are no poor people in Israel? Yeah, reparations was paid, but even if there are no poor people in Israel, it's not because of reparations, because of a responsible government, the government that is responsible for its people. So it is not an economic policy. It shouldn't be seen as an economic policy to solve the issue of poverty. It can help. It doesn't necessarily mean the government is going to abdicate its responsibilities to African Americans because, well, we'll pay them off. That is what he's refusing to see.
Would be left saying, well, whether they were caused by slavery or not, let's be solution oriented. What does it mean to be problem solvers here, right? Rather than to be stuck in the past in this quixotic quest to have some kind of moral absolution, right? Some closure that is, in my view, not practical, not in the cards, and not.
Closure is very, very important. Closure. Take, for example, a family who has maybe lost a child, maybe to kidnappers or something. Somehow they suspect that this child is dead, but they're not sure. They're not. They need closure. They need to know. Maybe someone has one of their family members go missing. Until the person is found either dead or alive, that closure isn't really there. That emotional closure. Finding the person dead and bringing the body back helps the family to heal and to move on. And this guy is telling us that closure isn't, it's not practical, it's not important. So you just move on, move on, move on. Human beings are emotional beings. They're not just ones and zeros. They're not just purely practical and logical beings. There's an emotional, spiritual component to us as human beings, and there are certain things that needs to be done to heal certain wounds. But somehow, Coleman thinks that closure is irrelevant. It's not practical.
Not going to do anything to solve the kinds of issues people are waking up with every day.
So there's a few things. I mean, it sounds like you're saying that reparations wouldn't stop or wouldn't fix many of the other problems we have in society. That seems like
no, not exactly.
an odd argument.
Yes. Well,
I mean, I hear you.
It wouldn't even fix the problem that it's alleged to fix, which is to sort of heal America's soul on the issue of slavery. I don't even think it would do that, let alone solve any of the
But
problems.
that's not what's alleged.
People are actually.
So why do you think it won't do that? What's your evidence for saying it won't do that? Do you think that the Israeli Jews today would have been a better healing, or if there was no reparations paid by Germany for the hurt done, do you think that would have somehow made them just forget everything without some sort of reparations being done? What is this dude talking about? He has no evidence whatsoever to show that reparations is not going to, in a way, assuage the grievances of African Americans. He's just saying things, and it makes no sense. It makes no sense, absolutely. It's not supposed to be an economic policy. It's not supposed to be a poverty alleviation policy. It can help, but irrespective of whether or not it helps in that sense, That's why I keep seeing it as in terms of a moral debt that the country owes to African Americans, not necessarily an economic policy. Because even white people, not all white people are well off today, not all white people are wealthy, they're still poor white people. So, despite the obvious advantages that the majority of white people had, not everybody still benefited from it. It's you will never get to a situation where a policy solves all the problems, which is part of the straw man that I keep talking about, that people like Coleman. So if it doesn't solve all the problem, then it's not worth even trying.
But hold on. That's fair. But Coleman, that's not what's being argued here, right? The reparations movement is not saying give black people reparations to heal America's soul. I'm not particularly interested in America's soul. I'm interested in my pockets. I'm interested in my community. I'm interested in creating the capacity for black wealth, for black institutions. And so this isn't some abstract moral project for America or fight for America's soul. I would argue America ain't got one. The real issue here is, will this be a proper form of redress? If you take my money and I ask for it back, and you say, well, I would give your money back, but you're just going to spend it poorly anywhere. You're still going to be broke after I give it back. That's not a persuasive argument for not giving me what's mine. The argument for reparations is that it's owed to us. This isn't an act of philanthropy or largesse. This isn't a favor. This is what is owed. And then after you give us what we owe, we will have the capacity to do what is best for our community. We have the opportunity to institution build, to produce intergenerational wealth, not in some sort of narrow capitalist way, but the idea that we can at least support one another, that we can build things for ourselves. And in doing so, that doesn't mean that we forfeit our citizenship. It doesn't mean that we're not still supposed to get safer neighborhoods. It doesn't mean that we're not supposed to get housing and healthcare. White people get that without reparations, right? It doesn't mean that we shouldn't get high quality schools. White people get that without reparations. The idea here is reparations is to make us whole again, right? Or to at least attempt to repair the damage done. And you're right, maybe nothing will be complete. But the fact that it isn't perfect doesn't mean it shouldn't be done at all. I'm gonna give you the last word too. I want to make sure you have an opportunity to respond to all of this. But the other piece of this is you say that it's not viable. It seems to me that reparations has never been more viable. It's never seemed more likely than it does right now. Whether it's HR 40 advancing, whether it's people not just considering whether to study slavery, but to actually examine particular proposals about it. Whether we're talking about the fact that mainstream politicians are talking about this, you've written about it. I know you have some critique of it, but it's a conversation that didn't happen 20 years ago. So it seems to me that we're right on the precipice of something major. But I want to give you, I have literally 1 minute left, and I want to give it to you to offer your response.
Sure. So let's be very concrete. A few months ago, maybe you covered this on your show, but the mayor of Oakland announced a program to give $500 a month to low-income Black families, right, and not low-income white families. My critique of that program is, yes, obviously we have to find ways beyond just giving cash, but improving the true drivers of wealth, which is not disposable income, but human capital and knowledge and skills and so forth. We have to find ways of addressing those issues for America's poor of all colors, right? But what does it mean for a multiracial, diverse country going into the future with the idea that we can have policies that are only for certain people based on skin color and ancestry, and not actually based on class, poverty, and wealth, right? Because if that's the problem we're trying to solve, and I think we would both agree, at least that is certainly a big problem, right? Poverty is really at the root of what we're talking about here. Poverty and dysfunction and opportunity and wealth. Then why not just base our policies on that? It more effectively targets disadvantage for people of all colors. It is less politically divisive because nobody feels blamed. Nobody feels like they're being blamed for things that happened hundreds of years ago. It's more sustainable, it's more popular, and it's more ethical. So to me, I'm comparing reparations to a policy that is class-based and seeing that it is just wanting in many ways by comparison.
If you want to address the roots or the effects of misogyny and sexism, telling me that we need to put a policy into place that will not make men feel aggrieved doesn't make any sense. If that policy is going to redress what was done to women, And it doesn't make any sense to say, well, we must do it in such a way that men don't feel accused, men don't feel aggrieved, they don't feel like they're being if a man feels threatened by a policy that's supposed to help women, then he's got to look at himself that what the hell is wrong with him. So in this same sense, if white people feel threatened by policy that is meant to redress the harm done to African Americans, you've got to ask yourself, what is wrong with white people? Feeling that way. I mean, if I were a white person, why would I feel any sort of way? No one is going to come into my pocket to take my money to use as reparations. We've already paid the taxes. The government will do with it whatever they want to do with anyway. Whether I want it or not, whether I object to it or not, the government always does what they want to do with taxpayer money. So all this is just nonsense. It's just nonsense. All right. Um, yep. So maybe I can take some comments, and if anyone wants to join, let me just put the link. Wants to join, we can talk for 30 minutes and we'll be done, right? So I just think that Coleman's arguments are, yeah, as Zachariah says, Charles, hope you're doing well. My question to those against reparations for Haitian Americans: why did those same people all of a sudden like this potential due repayment of $5,000? Well, Wolf, I'm not really sure what that repayment is, but I probably have a point on that. Would that $5,000 not be a form of reparations? Reparation is not just about slavery either. It's also about the systemic racism against us, Edos people. The plus 100 years after slavery ended, the Civil War ended, and people ended like that was it. And you are absolutely correct. People who are framing this as just a reparations for slavery are getting it wrong. They're missing everything because it wasn't all sunshine and roses for African Americans immediately slavery ended. It wasn't all that. There were still issues, and there are still issues. Zachariah Wolf says, this guy is the definition of a token Negro for the Republican Party. It's a shame because I am a black conservative. Charles, as you know, and I know black American history. This dude's a clown, Coleman. Yeah, he is actually a clown. And I know you are conservative. I if I were American, I'd be an American conservative as well. But the sort of arguments that these right wingers, black conservatives make, they make them look like stupid people, make them look like they're clowns actually, that they really don't understand. Because they think that they have to have a certain fealty to their political party and ideology, that they can't think for themselves, that if they have an opinion that is different from what is the standard conservative viewpoint or things, then they are no longer conservative. But that's not the way it should be, right? um, Said white Republicans today bank on black conservatives being a mouthpiece so they don't have to address the history of why reparations is fair for us, those people. That's my main issue with them. Exactly true. I mean, look at all the black conservatives who were jumping and jiving over Trump, Byron Donalds, and so on and so forth. Did they get anything out of Trump's administration? Nothing. They got nothing. You can't even, it's like they're non existent. But they're the ones that are going to be put in front of black people like minstrels to say certain things, to make it seem like it's okay for America to do certain things to black people. Black Americans are seen as second-class citizens today unless we fully agree with Democrats or Republicans, and even then we're just a vote. They say we are Americans but don't act like we are, and it's true. It really is true. If you see the way conservatives treat African Americans, they treat African Americans like the only smart African Americans are the conservative ones. Actually, the dumb ones are the right wing ones who appear to be smart, but they are not actually smart. Right? Charles, there's a black conservative on Twitter saying he hates black people and agree with Adolf Hitler. That's where we have gone now. Yeah, that's Kanye, right? Kanye has really gone off the rails. Kanye is crazy. He's nuts. And I wouldn't say he's crazy. He's a terrible person. I really don't want to invoke mental illness for people's terrible behavior, right? when someone does a terrible thing, they're blaming autism, like with Musk when he gave the Hitler salute, they're blaming autism. Nah, that's you. That's you. And Kanye's behavior, not mental illness, that's him. He's a terrible person. He's a piece of shit. Anyway, that's what I just had to cover on this topic today. I think Coleman Hughes is, to use the words of the great Glenn Lowry, my former, how will I put it? Will I say mentor? No, 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 not a mentor. My former hero. He's a lightweight, Wolf. He's a lightweight. Like, share, and subscribe. And I will see you in another live stream. It's bye for now.